I think that a reasonable compromise has been found now, that Ukraine is developing its relations with NATO, and it's not clear when it will come. Clearly, I think you obviously do, that the European perspective is more important and should come first. I also think it's important that the US doesn't lose out here, because it's the US that bilaterally that guarantees Ukraine's security, and NATO, I would argue, doesn't really add much of security in this regard. So that is my simple view, but this is very much Steve's topic.
No, I agree with the thrust of what Anders said. I mean, what was agreed by NATO ministers in December seems to be a good way to move forward. In fact, you can actually take most of the substance of a membership action plan and call it an annual national program. But what ultimately there has to be in Ukraine is greater consensus among the elite and then among the public about where they want to go. Right now you have a president who's very committed to a pro-NATO course, but it's a very divisive issue within the elite and among the public. To some extent, NATO, I think, has received more attention in Ukraine over the last 10 years because the European Union hasn't stepped up in a way that it could. And what you consistently, or what I've heard from Ukrainians, is NATO has an open door policy. And what Ukrainians will say is, we know we have to do a lot, but NATO has said if we do that, we could be members of NATO if we decide we want to do that. What they also say, though, is they've never received that signal from the European Union. That the European Union has always been hesitant to create, even with lots of conditionalities, a membership perspective. So because of that, I think there has been this more focus on NATO, whereas, as Anders said, in many ways, the European Union would be more appropriate to the current needs that Ukraine faces.
Okay, Barry in the back, and a question up here.
Barry Wood, Voice of America. To what extent is contagion in the region a real problem for the Ukraine and for the other countries? If something happens with the exchange rate pegs in the Baltic states, for example, or with Hungary being unable to finance itself, how does all that impact one country to another?
Anders, why don't you answer, and then Jayla might want to weigh in on that.
Thank you. I would argue that it's not so important directly. I happened to be in Kiev at the end of September, and it was a strange situation. Anybody who knew anything about finances could say that this is terrible. But there was a massive overheating. People were running around trying to find premises wherever they could at any price. And the only thing that had happened in people's eye was that the stock market, that seemed irrelevant anyhow, had fallen by 80%. But then I was back 2 weeks later, and it was as if the construction sites had been neutron bombed. All cranes were standing still, the cars, equipment was still there, but there were no people to be seen. And it was a massive sudden depression, what Jayla described, this sudden stop in the economy that is much greater. And the contagion here was simply that Ukraine was frozen out of international financial markets. Now, last month in February, Ukrainian steel production actually increased by 9%, because guess what? Ukraine is cheaper than everything else now, because it has had the biggest devaluation in the world. So therefore, Ukraine, I would argue, is right now not so sensitive to what is happening in the surrounding. What's important for the Ukrainian steel companies is that they're cheaper than the Russian steel companies, and they are, as long as Russia doesn't devalue more. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the region is an important trading partner for Ukraine, especially Russia is one of the largest trading partners. So deterioration of in the region obviously has implications, but I would think not as much, not unmanageable. But on the other hand, I think you're asking a larger question, which is that what's happening right now is a regional problem. and therefore the solution actually should be a regional solution. And if you look at what has happened in the last 5 years, yes, Ukraine, we talked about specifically Ukraine, but you could change the name and you would probably talk about a very similar story in many of the countries in the region, except perhaps some of the more countries with more conservative policies, like Czech Republic or Poland and so on. But you did see a very rapid credit growth. You did see very large capital inflows. You did see corporate bond issuance by companies which were not even rated. So it was not so different than what was happening here in the US, but more in the region. Therefore, it's now a question of Western European banks, their exposures in the region, and whether there will be an orderly solution to all this or not. Because at the end of the day, unless a regional approach is taken, it's going to get worse, and it's going to have effects, feedback effects from one side to the other. The region is also important in terms of trade, not only these financial linkages, but also trade linkages. So I think this is you asked a very pertinent question, and I think everyone is grappling to find a solution to it.
Jill, can I just follow up on that and ask you two maybe difficult questions? First, is the fund itself promoting a regional solution in Central and Eastern Europe? And secondly, as you see it, are the Western European partners doing enough to help that recovery in East Europe?
Preface here. I have to use the disclaimer that this is personal view, not the IMF view. So I can tell you from my perspective, yes, a regional approach is needed. And the fund always, in the last 5 years also, there was always the discussion about what's going on in the region, and there are many publications of the fund which look at these issues. And I think our MD even made some statements as early as last weekend. In terms of Western Europe, again, over the weekend there was this discussion, some niceties came out of it, but I think it's a very difficult question. The region is not homogeneous. There are some countries which are doing fine, and there are some countries which have much more difficulty. So it is a challenge, but I do think it's very much needed. A regional approach is very much needed.
Okay. Sure. Anders?
Yeah, let me follow up also. I think it should be emphasized that the World Bank, the EBRD, and the European investment banks are doing a lot. And they will probably put up about $4 billion this year in financing for Ukraine. And they are thinking very much like the IMF. And of course, they can also provide budget support. So the IFIs are all on one line on Ukraine. And then you have the European Union, which is not in the game at all. And right now, the European Union has provided support for two countries, effectively, Hungary and Latvia, which are within the European Union. And the total financing they have available for such cases for their own member countries is currently 25 billion euros, that's $31 billion. And then they have a pittance for other countries. I think they gave 100 million euro to Iceland in a loan, and they have not done anything whatsoever for Ukraine. Individual member countries supported Iceland and Latvia, but that hasn't happened either to Ukraine. So I think that this is the serious hole. But then, of course, we come to the United States. The United States has not provided balance of payment support to any of the countries.
Okay, question here.
Thank you. I'm Mike Halsell, Johns Hopkins SAIS. I'd like to return to Cesare's first question about NATO and the EU. First of all, just a one-sentence comment. The Finnish model may not be the Finnish model. Finland is actively considering reorienting its security So I'm not even sure that that's... Anna is sitting here, the DCM from Finland, but there's a white paper, a parliamentary commission. I'm not sure the Finnish model is always going to be the Finnish model, but more importantly, I think powers that be in Moscow understand that NATO is not going to invade Russia and that it's really not a security threat, but that in fact a Ukraine in the EU would in the long run be a much more serious threat to the powers that be in Moscow. And in fact, Foreign Minister Lavrov said as much several weeks ago, saying that they view EU enlargement in the same way as they do NATO enlargement. So my question is simply, if the EU should listen to Anders Åslund and start to get its act together with regard to Ukraine, do you expect that there'll be a strong pushback from Moscow?
Both of you.
Yes. No, I think the Russian position towards the relationship between Ukraine and the European Union is shaped very much by an understanding in Russia, in Moscow, that the European Union so far has not defined a membership perspective for Ukraine. And in some ways, it's similar to the Russian attitude towards Ukraine's declaration back in 2002 under Leonid Kuchma, when he said Ukraine's goal is to be a member of NATO. And it got very little reaction in Russia, in part because Russia at that time looked at where Ukraine was. It hadn't really moved in a decisive way to implement the reforms NATO was asking for. And they said that's not going to happen. It's not a serious prospect. You saw Russian concerns, though, come up very clearly last year when Yushchenko and Timoshenko signed the letter requesting a membership action plan, because they began to realize this is a real prospect. So I suspect if the European Union were to change its position, and all of a sudden within 3 or 4 years there was a prospect that the European Union might take in Ukraine, you would see a much stronger Russian pushback, because a Ukraine in the European Union is just as much out of Moscow's geopolitical orbit as a Ukraine in NATO.
In the back? Go ahead, Anders.
Yeah, let me just follow up. I think that the attitude from Moscow towards the European Union has changed this year. And I think the statement by Lavrov here was really a big novelty. And I think it's the gas war. During the gas war now, Russia is used to be able to play off the various European countries, even if the European Union didn't do all too much. The European Union said, we have one representative, and talk to him. I mean, admittedly 2 representatives, one from the Council of Ministers and one from the European Commission. But the European Union acted in unison for really the first time against Russia. And I think that made some impact. Thank you.
Yes.
Miroslava Gungadze, Voice of America. It's a question for Jayla Parabajaglu, if I pronounce it right. You mentioned in your presentation that Ukrainian authority actually agreed on the letter, and they sent a letter to IMF about the kind of solution and second tranche, and to extend their communication and program with IMF. So when we can expect the second tranche? Would it be a second tranche? And what is the next step for IMF with Ukraine? Thank you.
Okay. We are in discussions with the authorities right now. They are talking to see if they can get mobilized bilateral financing support, because that's crucial in determining how much adjustment they need to take. Therefore, I would think in the next week or two, or in the next couple of weeks, we should be hopefully back in Kiev to discuss more the details of the letter of intent. The way it works procedurally is that you agree with the authorities at the staff level on a draft memorandum for economic and financial policies. This then gets reviewed internally back at headquarters, needs to be approved by management, and then signed by the authorities. So it's a procedural event. Right now we are in the first phase of it, where we are discussing the necessary policy action that needs to be taken. And an important component of that is fiscal corrective measures, which one depends on what type of measures the authorities take, and with the parliament we'll have to see how things go. And the other one is how much bilateral financing they can get commitment on, and they're working very closely with the World Bank, and I hope there will be more progress in the coming days and weeks.
Ed?
Anders, if I heard you correctly, the last big wave of economic reform was in 2000. That was a long time ago. So the good economic performance of most of this decade is from the fruits of reform long time ago, and the most favorable external economic environment in a generation, I would submit, for Ukraine, in terms of commodity prices, steel prices, and so on. Would this current crisis be an impetus for deeper reform of the sort that, for example, Steve mentioned, energy sector reform? And would IMF conditionality be an instrument to push that reform forward? Because without a continuous reform process, it seems to me that Ukraine might be in the same hole again, giving another external shock.
Thank you. I should add there that substantial reforms continued until 2003. So there was a lot of legislation that started off, for example, the civil code, the customs code. But if you take after the Orange Revolution, the only significant legislation has been WTO accession and finally the law on the joint stock companies now. For the rest, extremely little has happened in terms of legislation. The sheer number of significant laws, which were, I guess, over 80 in 2000, are down to a dozen a year. And then you have, for example, an annual budget and an annual law on minimal wages. So Ukraine is pretty unique in hardly legislating. And this is a strange fact to compare with anybody. The World Bank did a study a few years ago about how much laws of various kinds, various transition countries had. And Ukraine came in the worst category of simply number of elementary reform laws that have been adopted. I've never understood why it can't happen, so therefore I dare not predict if it will happen now. But the logic that you present is, of course, impeccable, so I would expect it. I worked hard on this Blue Ribbon Commission that the UN set up. We did it in the fall of 2004. Of course, we expected Yushchenko to win, so we made a program that would be suitable for him to take over. And then the orange victors come in, and they are far too important to work. So they were just in euphoria, and no serious reform work at all started, apart from a few more of a democratic side, but not at all on the legal or economic or social side. So I think that this should be a wake-up call for Ukraine finally, that they haven't done enough reforms, and therefore the country, that's part of the reason why the country is so badly hit.
Andrei Ilarianov.
I have two questions, one economic one and the other political. Economic for Jayla. Jayla, you have attracted attention to the dramatic change in output trend and in forecast of contraction in output of Ukraine in a very short period of time. Do you have, or IMF has, any explanation what has happened and to what particular factors this dramatic change in trend could be attributed? And the political question would be probably first of all for Anders, maybe Steve you would contribute to this as well. Anders, you have said that one of the most important achievements of Ukraine over the last 4 or 5 years was Ukrainian democracy. And now we're coming to and this Ukrainian democracy should be probably to a very high extent attributed to personality of Viktor Yushchenko. Now we're having presidential elections with two rather strong candidates, and there is a very serious concern amongst different groups of people that it could be a very serious challenge for Ukrainian democracy. What would be your assessment of probability for survival of Ukrainian democracy in new political environment at first, and what would be probability of being Navy port Sevastopol under Ukrainian control by year 2017?
Jayla?
On contraction in output growth, one key factor, of course, is global recession. Steel is one of the, we said 45% of exports, and the contraction in some of the Asian countries, some of the European trading partners and so on has major implications. If you also look at Asia, these countries are also going through 40-50% drop in their exports. So it's not specific to Ukraine that exports are falling very, very sharply. In the case of Ukraine, it almost happened immediately, whereas you saw much more in other countries starting in January, February, this contraction in exports. And I think the reason for that has a lot to do with very focused, basically large share of steel in exports, so being very exposed, if you like, to one product, which the price of which also went down by 60%. So not only you have the price impact, but you also have the demand for that particular product, which collapsed initially. Also, if you look at how the growth was financed, it was very much financed from flows abroad. And that has also declined very sharply. So for the companies to be able to expand their activities, all of a sudden you face not only a very sharp decline, but you also have to pay a lot of the short-term debt which was in foreign currency. And with the exchange rate depreciation, that has a big toll both on the corporate sector and the household sector. So these components, I think, explain why Ukraine was subject to such sharp and almost immediate decline in growth.
Anders?
Thank you, Andre. On the politics, what can happen? The first thing is whether there will be any kind of constitutional change before the presidential elections. I think that is quite likely. Both Yanukovych and Tymoshenko are now in favor of more parliamentary system. Tymoshenko wants a constitution which is approximately like the Polish or Lithuanian or Finnish, that is with a popularly elected president but with basically parliamentary system. Yanukovych wants a purely parliamentary system where the president should be elected by the parliament. And they have come together a couple of times and adopted the law of the cabinet of ministers, which have then fallen by the wayside. They could actually carry out a constitutional change before the elections, and I wouldn't be surprised if they do. But whenever anything happens in Ukrainian politics, it comes all of a sudden. And the second thing is if Yushchenko will stay until January. He has now virtually no popularity. His popularity is at 2-3%. He's number 6 in the ranking among the possible presidential candidates. And he's now persistently blocking every step that Tymoshenko is doing, even when she's doing what Yushchenko proposed just before. For example, pushing when Tymoshenko wanted to legislate private sales of agricultural land, Yushchenko vetoed it, although it is one of his old standard questions. Similarly, has vetoed every privatization that Timoshenko has proposed, although that was his old position. So I wouldn't be surprised if they impeach Yushchenko. They have adopted actually a law on impeachment, one of the few laws that they have adopted. And it could happen all of a sudden. Then when there finally are presidential elections, Yanukovych is now far ahead of Timoshenko in the opinion polls, but he can hardly win because he can hardly get over 45%. Because the other part of the country will vote against Yanukovych. So it will be number 2, the runner-up, who will win in the runoff. Timoshenko is, of course, today the obvious candidate, but the third sudden riser, the rogue in Ukrainian politics, is a 34-year-old Arseny Yatsenyuk, who looks very much like a political genius. So I think that these are the 3 relevant candidates, and I wouldn't be too worried by any of them. I think that we are likely to see democracy surviving. I find it very difficult to see any extreme ideology rising, and the Ukrainian political views are surprisingly much in the middle. Having said that, you would expect that this massive declines in GDP and unemployment must rise to the order of 15% under these conditions, that this will lead to various social pressures that could take strange expressions. But we don't see it as yet. It's strangely calm. I've been looking here for serious social protests, but for the last 5 years in Ukraine, there have been small protests taking place all the time. So you don't see the massive sense of explosion that I think is possible, for example, in Russia. But okay, people are demonstrating every day, so why not today? Thank you.
Final question or comment here at the head table.
Thank you. Viktor Nikityuk, Deputy Chief of Mission, Embassy of Ukraine. I would like to join Steve Pfeiffer and others who congratulated already you, Anders, with your wonderful job. This is a result of tremendous work and its comprehensive expertise, so that's very sincere appreciation. Just very briefly, I would like to say that through the whole way of 18 or so years of Ukrainian independence, there are, I would say, 3 pillars what reflect the significance of those years for us. The first one, I would say, this is Ukraine's commitment to democracy. The second one is commitment to market economy. And the third one is Ukraine's commitment to European and Euro-Atlantic values and to the mainstream of European and Euro-Atlantic integration. So I believe, Anders, that your book reflects very adequately the truth that these pillars are in place with all the turmoil and mess that could sometimes or quite often be heard as characterizing our internal landscape. Those 3 pillars are firmly in place. The second thing I would like to say that, speaking about the challenges and threats, the most immediate at the moment, I would say, is certainly financial crisis. And today's discussions is a good opportunity to emphasize once again how critical is the international assistance to Ukraine in this regard. And the third, with new U.S. administration in place, I have to say we draw conclusion from what we heard from statements on behalf of President Obama, Vice President Biden, other U.S. officials, that Ukraine will stay in the focus of U.S. strategy and of U.S. strategic interest in the region. We very much rely to our further close cooperation in enhancing and deepening the strategic partnership that we already have, including inter alia Ukraine's claim for Euro-Atlantic integration. And the last but not least, just a few words about the Finnish model. I would say that the Finnish model should not be interpreted in a narrow way, that Finland is not a member of NATO. There are a lot of things in the Finnish model that we not only would like, but have to follow in terms of, for instance, economic development, in terms of Ukraine's EU perspective, and many others. So the Finnish model is certainly very much appreciated for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those very positive words. I think it's a good conclusion. Let me again congratulate Anders on the book and for today's presentation. Thanks to Stephen and Jayla for very constructively and helpfully enhancing our conversation. Thanks to all of you for coming. Meeting adjourned.